Please welcome the panel on Countdown, Improving Military Readiness for the 21st Century, moderated by Susan Eisenhower, Chairman and CEO, the Eisenhower Group, Inc.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning here at the Milken Institute to discuss, I think, one of the most important issues of our time. I am here with an extraordinary panel, and how honored we are to have such a well-informed set of decision makers, actually, in the course of our history. We have General Joseph Dunford, who is the 19th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral James Stavridis, who is the Supreme Commander of NATO, Ambassador Kevin Rudd, who is the Australian Ambassador to the U.S. and the 26th Prime Minister of Australia. We have Lisa Gordon-Hagerty, who is Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, and Mara Karlin, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities. I can't think of a more well-qualified group to discuss the issues that are very much on all of our minds. So I'd like to start with General Dunford. And I'd like to ask you, let's start at 30,000 feet. I'd like to know, and I'm sure the audience would too, what is America's place in the world as the military sees it? And what are we trying to accomplish with this new debate that's underway about readiness, about capabilities, about the future of warfare?
Hey, thanks, Susan. It's an honor to join you here this morning, as well as the other panelists. At the very basic level, the U.S. military, with its allies and partners, we've got to deter nuclear war. Secondly, we've got to deter conventional conflict and then respond in the event that deterrence fails. But as you alluded to, we're doing that in an incredibly difficult, challenging time, and most people would say certainly the most challenging, complex, volatile security environment since World War II. We've got an alignment of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. I mentioned nuclear weapons. It's a time when there's no arms control, there's no non-proliferation regime in place, and there are now 3 major nuclear powers instead of 2 major nuclear powers. We're doing it at a time when perhaps we don't have the coherence in our worldview with our allies and partners that we would need to have to deal with those particular challenges. We're doing it at a time when the pace of change is accelerated, and this whole conference talks about emerging technology and the implications. There's certainly implications for the U.S. military in that regard. And then I mentioned the consensus amongst our allies and partners. I think you could say the same here domestically. Not a political statement, just a fact. I think there was a time when, in the Cold War, we would look back on that now as the simple time when everybody understood who the enemy was, everybody understood what we needed to do to deal with the adversary that we had identified. That's no longer the case. So I think what the U.S. military and our allies and partners need to do is remain relatively constant. The change, and I know that's what we'll talk about in the panel this morning, the context within which we are deterring nuclear war, conventional war, and responding in events that deterrence fails has changed significantly even over the past decade.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's given us a wonderful set of statements to pursue our conversation. Admiral Stavridis, I would like you to say something about how you think the character of war has changed.
A pretty broad question.
I know.
Let's take a look at Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine. I think it's instructive as follows. The cheap argument would be to say, oh, look at how drones are taking everything over. Look at how space and connectivity has become so fundamental to warfare. Look how artificial intelligence is impinging on the battlefield, and all those things are true. So if you wanted to make it a novel, you would say that that part of the war is like Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. And that's all true. Warfare is changing, but the war in Ukraine is another novel. It is All Quiet on the Western Front by Remarque. Oh. It's blood, guts, hand-to-hand combat, tanks, artillery shells, warfare that goes an inch at a time, something a great ground commander like Joe Dunford understands more deeply than this old admiral. But here's the point. Warfare is changing. That dial is turning, I think, inexorably toward AI and cyber and space connectivity and all of the high-end capability. We need to be mindful that war can continue to be oh so 20th century. It's a bit of both.
Very well said. And with that in mind, of course, nuclear weapons has been in front and center of our deterrent capability. I'm wondering, Lisa, if you could say something about the lethality of nuclear weapons and how that might compare with other potential weapons that might also be existential in nature.
Yes, well, thank you, Susan, and it's a pleasure and a delight to be here this morning and be with this august group of panelists. Nuclear weapons obviously are a situation of last resort. However, we find ourselves in the 21st century in a situation that is unprecedented. We've got major buildup of Chinese nuclear systems, something we've never seen before, and then of course the diversification of the Russian stockpile, their theater systems. So we're finding that we have now, the United States has two near peer nuclear adversaries. So not only do we have to deal with that, but we have to also confront the realities of Iran, a potential nuclear Iran, as well as the DPRK, North Korea. So right now, our national security strategy, both for the previous administration and the one before that, focused on fighting on a single front, in one single theater. We now have to reimagine what force readiness looks like and military readiness on two theaters, is to be able to fight not only conventional wars in two theaters, but also nuclear war, possibly. The challenge with that is, of course, situation we see now. Admiral Stavridis mentioned Ukraine. Well, we believe that the Russians have possibly stationed nuclear weapons outside theater, tactical nuclear weapons. And when I say tactical, every nuclear weapon is strategic. It doesn't matter how small or what the capacity is of the nuclear weapon, whether it's a bomb or a weapon. They're all strategic in nature. So how do you respond to something like that? The idea of operating through conventional war and then turning ultimately into nuclear war is something that it's very difficult for us to imagine, but it's something that really the reality is here and now, that we have to think about that, confront it, and be able to operate through that. Remember, our nuclear deterrent and our strategy for strategic posture is the very foundation of our national security, and it's a conversation that we must have.
Well, thank you very much. Ambassador Rudd, I know that you're a great expert on China, but you're also the Australian ambassador to the United States, Australia being one of our longtime allies. Could you say something about this special mixture, especially at this particular time?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on this panel with so many distinguished Americans who've been in uniform and those who've worked at senior levels of the civilian arm of national security policy in this country, and been our privilege to work with them all. I think my core message to a group like this is America in 2025 remains the indispensable global power, militarily, strategically, economically, technologically, and therefore it remains the fulcrum of the global order. When America in its history chose to walk away from that role in the 20s, when the world needed an indispensable power following the First World War, we saw what happened in the history of the world in the 20s and 30s. And, as you know, through your Harry Truman and your grandfather, Ike, this massive reset in post-war American global strategic engagement, impacting allies in Europe and across the Pacific, has been the fulcrum of strategic stability for more than 3/4 of a century. Yeah. So for allies right now, I think it's important for us to reflect back to our friends and colleagues in Washington, D.C., that this fundamental strategic reality has not changed. And our challenge and opportunity as allies, either in the Indo-Pac or in the transatlantic, is actually to lean in further. As General Dunford said before, deterrence is the essential underpinning instrument of strategic stability and, frankly, post-war economic growth. Let us never forget that fact. And as Admiral Stavridis said, this is a multidimensional phenomenon. When we talk about deterrence, it's not like cafeteria security policy. I have a little piece of this, and drones have been popular in the most recent Hollywood movies. I'll take 2 of those, thank you very much. It's a much more serious business. It's multi-domain, multi-dimensional, and multi-alliance. So allies now, in my judgment, whether it's in Australia or elsewhere in the world, leaning in to this deterrence task. And if the United States is expecting more of us, that is understandable. We should rise to that challenge.
Very good. So, Mara, we now are ready to talk about what modernizing our forces might look like against this set of challenges. Could you say something about how you regard the readiness question and what elements you think are part of that?
Absolutely. Thank you. It is such a treat to be here with such distinguished panelists. So look, we have had a vision of narrow war for most of the last 2.5 decades, right? The American military was fighting terrorists and militias far away. Actually, the longest contemporary wars in U.S. history. Nothing was really asked of the American public, and folks didn't pay a lot of attention to how those wars went. We have actually shifted when we look particularly at the Middle East and at Europe over the last few years from narrow war to total war, right? We have seen this with Russia's war on Ukraine, which has very much spanned the continuum, where you've had militia groups, you've had armies on a battlefield, you've had the threat of nuclear weapons. Actually, the highest threat of nuclear weapons in the last few years than in the last 55 or so years. Right? So we've seen that shift to total war, and we've seen actually the mobilization of industry and of society in that regard. I would suggest we've seen actually something that rhymes as well in the Middle East wars. So given all of this, it means that for the United States, we need to reconceptualize how we think about the future of conflict, looking across the technological picture, looking across the types of people who we want joining the military, and forcing ourselves to be a lot more creative in the sorts of scenarios that we can envision. So maybe just looking at nuclear issues for one moment, right? As I noted, we've been the closest to nuclear use in more than a couple decades over the last few years. We have this problem, as General Dunford noted, and Lisa noted as well, where what used to be an issue of just 2 major powers, the US and the Soviet Union and then Russia, now it's a 3-party problem with the Chinese. What does that look like? And then third, we have this really interesting dilemma, which is that we are very used to thinking about bad guys getting nuclear weapons, right? Right now, there's a conversation about what happens with Iran. But a lot of our partners are actually starting to think about it. The conversation is shifting in places like South Korea, Japan, Germany, Poland. And so we could start to see, at a minimum, more latent nuclear powers. What is that going to mean for the security environment? All of which means we are living in the most turbulent period in all of our lifetimes, a period of shifting paradigms. And for the US, not only do we have to rethink what does it mean militarily in terms of how to prepare for these changing conflicts, but also what does it mean as the political, economic, and security order is fundamentally shifting.
Thank you very much. Well, called me old-fashioned, but, and I know this isn't exactly the topic of our conversation today, but one of the tools in the toolbox, of course, is diplomacy. This is not up to the military, but it's been gratifying for me to see that the military is engaging with other militaries around the world, even with our adversaries. General Stavridis, you are commander of NATO. Would you like to say something about diplomacy and the opportunity to move forward in terms of keeping the lines of communications open.
Well, I want to begin by acknowledging my promotion to general. I know. General
Did I say that? Oh my gosh.
I've never been more proud.
Admiral, forgive me. Forgive me. We will not go to the Army-Navy game together, though.
Go Navy.
I'm happy to respond. Before I do that, I want to say something to Ambassador Rudd, and I want to say it to everybody, all the Americans in the room. We have no finer ally than Australia. They have stood with us in every war since their nation was founded. Their troops are brave and professional. They fell under my command, under Joe's command in Australia, in Afghanistan. A great ally, partner, and friend. What I want to pick up on, yeah I agree. What I want to pick up on in your comment is, what do militaries do besides all the things that we've talked about? You named one very important one, which is what could broadly be construed as soft power. It is engaging in humanitarian operations, in sailing hospital ships, in building clinics, schools, and wells, in helping with rule of law in very unruly places. Militaries do all those things without firing a bullet. The most impactful deployment I ever launched, my view, was ordering the deployment of the huge American hospital ship, USNS Comfort, throughout Latin America, 400,000 patient treatments. Do you think that creates security for the United States? You bet it does. And I saw that in Colombia. I saw that in Latin America. I saw it in Afghanistan, where brave USAID and Peace Corps volunteers working with the military did something that didn't involve launching missiles, but involved launching ideas and helping create security in that sense. So I'd love to broaden the conversation to include that. I think it's a tragic mistake to unwind USAID, to talk about getting rid of the Peace Corps. These are penny-wise and pound-foolish moves that undercut our security. Militaries can be part of creating that. It's an important role as well.
Yes, I was going to call on you, yes.
So, Susan, one thing you said was it's not the military's job to do diplomacy. The audience might be surprised that in my last assignment, I think it's a fair thing to say that I probably spent 50% of my time meeting with my counterparts around the world. And you say, well, why do you do that? One, you want to give our political leadership options for us to do coherent collective action when it's required. In most cases, as we talk about the changed character war, one of the factors is any conflict is going to have global implications, and you want to have maximum flexibility for our political leaders to put together coalitions where appropriate. And then the entire architecture of the U.S. military, we talked about deterrence earlier. Mm-hmm. The foundation of our deterrence for decades has been our ability to project power when and where necessary to advance our national interests. And that's built on an architecture of basing rights, overflight rights, partners and allies around the world. And so maintaining that system of power projection, maintaining that ability to have interoperability and flexibility in creating coalitions, alliances, as the case may be, is a critical part of the U.S. military. Because not only do I echo Admiral Stavridis' remarks about Australia, but what I would say is, if you think about the context within which we're advancing U.S. national interests, I would simply say that not only do we need to do the kinds of things that Admiral Stavridis talked about, but a fundamental assumption I make is we cannot secure the United States of America without a network of allies and partners, which has been the source of strength for the United States since World War II. And it doesn't mean we can't do some maintenance on the nature of our alliances and partnerships. It doesn't mean we can't realign some of the burden sharing and make them fit for the 21st century. But the idea that we would not go to war as part of a coalition is I just can't comprehend that.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for that clarification. I was being a little bit presumptuous in saying that, because I think many people who are not in national security affairs do not realize the diplomatic role that the military plays. They think that's the State Department's job, but in truth, I think this has been very well articulated and illuminating for everyone here in the audience. It seems to me that there's no place where some kind of emphasis should be placed in terms of diplomacy, if you will, or at least keeping the lines open, and that's in the nuclear area. And Lisa, you outlined some significant concerns about how close we were at various times to some kind of deep misunderstanding. I actually didn't sleep for about 4 months after February 2022. Could you say a little bit more about the status of these contacts in the nuclear area? And by the way, maybe you and others here could make a comment about, do we have those open lines of communication around cyber or artificial intelligence tools that are being used? Because the potential for misunderstanding is fairly significant there too.
Certainly. Well, Susan, the relationship that the United States government, through the National Nuclear Security Administration, which runs the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile, has wonderful, long-standing relationships with many of our partners and allies, especially the UK, a very special relationship with them, sharing information about our U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile with the French and with others. We have a great strategic stability program ongoing with many different nations, allies, partners, and those that we might not necessarily think of in those categories. There's a great deal of work in radiation protection and in science and understanding about how to safely handle material, how to procure it, and most importantly, keeping it out of bad guys' hands. It's unprecedented, the lack of understanding about how much radioactive material and nuclear material is out there. It's cause for concern, but the relationships that the U.S. government has with others is very good. It continues to be using international fora such as the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and other organizations like that, both regional and global, that can solidify those kinds of relationships and make sure that we do have a strategic stability line of communication and communications with our partners and allies, and again, those that may fall outside the scope of that.
Right, but
Susan,
yes,
if I could
please.
just make a quick two-finger.
Yeah.
China looms large over this whole conversation, and I would just say there's two things related to your question that we ought to just highlight. One is that we don't have effective arms control discussion with China, and it would be hard to say that we have strategic stability with China since we're not having conversations about what strategic stability is and how to implement that. And then I would also say that just the lack of effective military-to-military dialogue with China is of great concern. Lack of transparency, lack of crisis communication. I mean, at the very minimum, you'd want to be talking to China to mitigate the risk of miscalculation and to manage a crisis so it doesn't become a conflict. And I think those are areas of concern.
They really are. And I would like to ask you, Mr. Ambassador, you're in a way on the front line there with China, given your regional location and the rest of it. How concerned should we be that some kind of conflagration is going to break out, that there's going to be some incident in the shorter term around this particular competitor, perhaps adversary?
Well, to back in what General Dunford just said, there is, first of all, a nuclear modernization program in China itself, both in terms of the shall we say, the spread of their nuclear arsenal and its quantitative footprint. And the Chinese have deliberately said no to arms control discussions, negotiations, or even engagement with the United States in any substantive fashion. Not been through want of effort on the part of the United States. It's been through, frankly, a non-preparedness on the part of Beijing to take up that opportunity. This, for all of us in the Indo-Pacific, is a cause for great and continuing concern. On your broader question, Susan, about the risk of crisis, conflict, and war across the Indo-Pac, the number one stabilizing factor always is the credibility of US and allied deterrence in relation to any Taiwan-related scenario. This is core central business. And deterrence has two arms: a Chinese perception and conclusion about US allied and Taiwanese capabilities on the one hand, and of course calculations about political resolve and will to deploy those capabilities on the other. So that's the fulcrum of it. In terms of what China itself is up to, and I've been a student of China now, I worked out the other day, Jim, 50 years next year.
Wow.
My God, I feel like Methuselah all of a sudden. But I've seen things come and go in Chinese politics. I started studying Chinese language at university when Mao was still alive. He died later that year. There's been a few changes since then, if you haven't picked it up. But the bottom line is this: China now represents a formidable strategic competitor in relation to the United States in all domains, and frankly in every one of the domains that we've been discussing as well, down to, Jim, military diplomacy, down to forms of foreign aid, down to the dimensions of the Belt and Road Initiative, through to the acquisition of remarkable capabilities by the PLA Navy, Army, Air Force, as well as their strategic rocket force, PLAF, I should say. So this is a significant competitor, multi-dimensional competitor, and given the nature of the political system, one whose central strategy tends not to change. It is simply drilled down on. So is there a risk? Yes, because there are so many dynamic factors at work within the region, not least Taiwanese domestic politics and not least China's calculation about their reunification agenda. Can we sustain peace and stability? Yes, but as Ronald Reagan reminded us, peace through strength, and that, as its core axiom, is peace through strength through deterrence. If we do that well, we have another decade of strategic stability. If we fail on that, then I think we're in some difficulty.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to turn our attention a little bit to what the reform and the readiness picture looks like. We've talked a lot about weapons systems. I'd like some, if you would agree, a little conversation here before we take questions from the audience about what this transformation means. I'd like to add to this that it's not all about sophisticated new technology. Some of it includes a lot of other things, like the state of our readiness with respect to our recruiting and our military personnel. The GAO came out with a horrifying report about a year ago, I think, or maybe 6 months ago, about the state of many of our barracks and living conditions for our troops, and other things. Mara, I think when you looked at an integrated strategy for your administration, the Biden administration, surely this was somewhere on your desk, the question of internal readiness in terms of the military force.
Absolutely. So a couple key points here. One is thinking about priorities. Look, there's been no global power like the United States. That means a whole lot of issues line up on its doorstep. And so really prioritizing, and in fact, the last National Defense Strategy was probably the punchiest and pithiest in saying the number one concern is China. It is the pacing challenge, and that's because there's no other country with the will and increasingly the capability to try to fundamentally. Personal means you actually have to look at all of this together and then your solutions together, right, in a really integrated way. So those are all really key elements, and they help make deterrence, and if, God forbid, we get in the situation where we have to win a war, more plausible. So how do you think about reform? Let me take a moment to explain how we shouldn't think about reform. And I think we've seen a lot of this, frankly, with the approach DOGE has taken to date inside the Pentagon. One, we need to remember that the Department of Defense offers a very unique product, right? American security. No one else offers that product. And if it fails, like most startups do, it's not just that money is lost and people are out of jobs, people die, right? So that product is singular and important. That means that you're going to think about risk differently. Another thing worth highlighting and looking at reform is the unique circumstances of the military. So think about how many folks are on your board, right? A handful probably. The Department of Defense has 535 members of its board, the entire US Congress. Think about how much you control your budget. The Department of Defense actually doesn't totally control its $850 billion plus budget. Think about the most strategic decisions your companies deal with. The Department of Defense cannot on its own make those sorts of decisions. The commander-in-chief can't either, right? So realizing that reform has all of these barriers to entry, and yet we need to take it tremendously seriously. The fact that the entire U.S. military can't pass a clean audit other than the U.S. Marine Corps, that's not a great thing, right? As taxpayers, we shouldn't feel fantastic about that. The fact that regulations have become so much clunkier and more complicated, not a good thing. And what you're hearing from all of us, you have a much more complex security environment, so you've got to find ways to change in line with that.
Yes, thank you very much. General Dunford, you were, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you worked with all of the services in a very intimate way. Do you have some comments about the internal set of challenges facing any kind of new look at readiness?
I do, Susan, but maybe, first of all, I think Mara's right. There's a lot of challenges, and when you read about modernization, you read about acquisition reform, you read about stabilizing budgets, you read about the complexity of the decision-making that's there, you read about the lack of expertise in emerging technology and so forth. But there's a bigger problem that maybe would just help frame the discussion, and it's this. We need to recruit and retain high-quality people today, and they need to be trained, organized, and equipped to be immediately responsive to meet today's requirements and to be able to deter conflict today and respond if deterrence fails. And at the same time, we need to prepare the force of tomorrow, leveraging emerging technology and being able to deal with some of the challenges in this all-domain environment that we just spoke about. And I want to say this because I don't want the problem to be oversimplified when we have our discussion. I used to say to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force when I was in my last job, I said, Dave, his name was Dave Goldfein, I'd say, Dave, your job is pretty easy. All I need you to do is maintain and employ the whole United States Air Force you have today, plus a little bit more we would like to have. And then I need you to identify what part of the Air Force you're going to take down today so we can build tomorrow's Air Force. And that's the tension. I mean, every leader in here deals with the tension of how do you prioritize and allocate resources to meet today's challenges, and then how do you assume some risk in meeting today's challenges with meeting tomorrow's challenges. And I always think about the world in terms of rubber balls and crystal balls, and the U.S. military responding to a crisis is a crystal ball. You can't drop it. And so this challenge, which is sometimes, it makes it sound like Congress is incompetent, the people in the Pentagon are incompetent, the executive branch is incompetent. I'm not suggesting there's not a lot of things we could do better, but I do think it's important to just recognize for a minute the complexity of the challenge in the managing of risk that goes on every day between meeting today and tomorrow's crises.
Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, just a short intervention on the other side of the shop. China has none of those challenges. It does not have a budget problem in terms of the military. It does not have a challenge in terms of the centrality of the command structure. If Xi Jinping determines there shall be more allocations to cyber warfare, my observation as a student of the Chinese system is that within about 3 months, those funds begin to flow through. So therefore, in this environment in which we now find ourselves, uniquely since 45, and as Kara rightly pointed out, the absolute strategic clarity, clarion-type clarity of the last National Defense Strategy, identifying China as the pacing threat. On this resourcing question, on this rapidity of the flow-through of funds into kit, equipment and capabilities, you are not facing a normal competitor. You are not facing a competitor constrained by our own constitutional laws, processes and arrangements. I simply add that as a sobering additional reflection.
Admiral Stavridis, you have a two-finger and then I have a question for you.
I want to pick up where Joe Dunford just dropped us, which is the personnel recruiting challenge. So you look at our cohort that comes out of American high schools and say to yourself, okay, what percentage of them do I think would be eligible to join the U.S. military if they were so inclined to do? because, of course, it's a volunteer force. And I find most Americans think, well, you know, 3/4 of them could certainly do a few push-ups and are smart enough and they're coming out of high school. Wrong answer. Only 25% of American youth are even eligible to join the U.S. military. 75% are too obese, have drug problems, have convictions, have medical problems, don't have the intellectual acumen to do it, even though they're high school graduates. So as General Dunford says, when he would turn to these service chiefs and say, hey, why can't you get recruiting up? The fundamental problem is the cohort from which you're recruiting. So point one, that's a national effort to get behind and improve. And then point two, we haven't really touched on it, but an enormous part of all this is maintenance and repair of all this equipment. We tend to think that, oh, these big, beautiful destroyers and these gorgeous F-35 aircraft and these pristine M1A1 tanks are all going to be ready to go. Wrong. It is a huge effort to do that maintenance and repair. It's not glamorous, it's boring, but you have to get it done, and it's an area where our readiness is really impinged. So I'd just add those two challenges that the department has to wrestle with. Go ahead, you had a question.
Well, yes, I was curious to know from you, you've been in a unique, well, I should say a very singular situation. There aren't that many SACURs. How would you compare the challenges in this respect between the United States and our European allies?
Well, first of all, we have a tendency in the United States to denigrate Europe collectively, in my view. And we kind of forget Europe is 450 million people. We're about 350 million here. Their economy collectively is the second largest in the world. It's had some stutter steps of late, but it's a very robust economy fundamentally. And here's one that often surprises Americans. How much do you think those, quote, freeloading Europeans, end quote, spend on defense? Well, collectively, the Europeans have the second largest defense budget in the world. It's larger than China. It's way larger than Russia's. And it's kind of mismanaged. It doesn't fit together. There's a lot of sand in the gears of it. But boy, is there a ton of potential over there in terms of economic and security. So as I looked at it as Supreme Allied Commander and looked at the United States on one side and at the time 27 other nations, you know, I felt like let's get them to pull a little harder, and they can do that, but we ought to do it in a way that moves them forward and moves these alliances forward as we've been discussing. I'll close with a quote from Churchill, the world's most quotable man. Churchill said, you know, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies, with all the frustrations and the back and forth, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting a war without allies. We need to stop denigrating Europe and our Pacific allies, pull them toward us, work collectively. I think that is a big part of readiness for us.
Susan, okay. Just a quick two-finger. When I think really it started when Admiral Stavridis was in Europe. And I think if we look at today as a snapshot in time, you know, we would say, are we where we need to be? No, we're not. Is European military capability what we would want it to be? No. Have we emerged into the 21st century as fast as we want? No. But if you look at the progress that's been made in these countries over the past decade, a couple of things have happened. Number one is there is a common understanding of the challenge of Russia. And there has been significantly increased resources applied to European defense. And to be honest with you, the methods of ensuring readiness, the cooperation and exposing readiness to the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, all those things have been areas of pretty significant progress. We need to put our foot on the accelerator for sure. But I do think I can certainly say, looking back over the past decade, that NATO is much more capable today than it was a decade ago, and the trajectory is in the right direction. And yes, we do need to put our foot on the gas pedal.
Amen.
Mara, you had a two-finger.
Thank you. I just wanted to add and really footstomp a point, which is that the U.S. military almost never goes to war on its own. In fact, the United States doesn't win its Revolutionary War on its own. It needs French support. And that's pretty meaningful when you look at it. Even just look at recent history. You have dozens and dozens of countries, including Australia, that are fighting in places like Afghanistan. And you can question how much that would have been on their priority list if not for their relationship with the United States. That's incredibly powerful. You know, Ambassador Rudd, I think, very rightly highlighted the challenges China doesn't have, right, that the U.S. does have. I would note, however, China doesn't have something else, which is it does not have an unparalleled network of allies and partners willing to die for it, right? Willing to fight for it. Russia doesn't really either. It's had a handful of North Koreans fight for it, but that's about it. North Korea doesn't. The Iranians generally don't. When you walk through it, you see this really extraordinary position the United States has been in across history to have allies and partners around the world willing to fight for it, willing to fight alongside of it for a wide range of issues. And I would just wrap by highlighting, exactly as my colleagues have noted, the European investment in their defense is exactly right. It is on the right trajectory. There are some folks who believe that that means one doesn't need to spend time on Europe anymore, right? You can sort of just put that in the parking lot and focus, say, on the Indo-Pacific. The challenge with that is that what happens in different regions have echoes with one another, right? The Chinese have learned a whole lot watching the war in Ukraine, and you can see that vice versa. So unfortunately, it's very hard and arguably quite astrategic to just take an entire region and just put it in the parking lot.
Can I add one thought on China, because we've talked about their advantages and they're streamlined and they're moving out, and all those things are true. They're not 10 feet tall. They have significant challenges. I learned a lot about that listening to and reading Ambassador Rudd's books. Everything from demographics to environmental concerns to an overheated property market. We could go on. They have challenges as well. I want to highlight one big challenge, I think, as a military officer, and General Dunford will get this. We'll do a thought experiment. Everybody here pretend you're a Chinese admiral or general. You can pick. You can be a Chinese admiral or general. Okay, I have a question for all the Chinese senior military. All of you who have actual combat experience, please raise your hand. Not a single hand goes up. If you were all American admirals or generals, and I said, how many of you have significant combat experience at every stage of your career? How many hands go up? Yeah. Pretty much every hand in the room. Now, you can argue that's not to our credit. We've been in a lot of wars. China has avoided armed conflict. But experience matters, and I think it's another point to be made as we do this overall evaluation of the pacing threat.
I have to call on you, Ambassador Rudd, yes.
Yeah, I think the great danger for us all is to underestimate or overestimate the nature of the Chinese strategic challenge. I often say this: China, to my American friends, ain't 6'3". China's about 5'8", 5'8".
Hey, that looks tall to me.
But you know something? It's growing, and just need to be mindful of it. On the core question of alliances, you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to dip back into Chinese strategic literature for the last 15 years. A central priority of China's diplomacy, international economic aid, is to fracture, and its economic presence is to fracture US alliances in the Indo-Pac and in Europe, wherever they can, because they've worked this out. And finally, a small anecdote. Years and years ago, when we could still have reasonable discussions in Beijing, I used to be regularly invited when I was head of a think tank to address the Chinese National Defense University. The last topic I was asked to address back then in Chinese was, why is Australia still an ally of the United States? So you'll enjoy this, Kara. I've got about 350 PLA 1 and 2 stars in front of me and me. okay, on the stage. Kind of fun. And so I go through the reasons, going back to World War II and the origins of our strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific theatre of war. That's all fine. We get to the officers' mess at the end, and they lean across the table and they ask me this question. Hey, Kevin, said, why is it that America ended up with all the good allies and we got all the crappy ones? I thought that was kind of interesting. As I said, that was a few years ago. But never underestimate the, shall I say, the turbocharging ability that this represents for the United States. The force multiplier represents for the United States, as Jim has eloquently described. And I'd say to Mara, vive Lafayette in terms of the events